The Matrix is a modern classic associated with mind-bending sci-fi, groundbreaking action choreography, and Andrew Tate. But you'd never think it was directly inspired by the 1981 French philosophy book Simulacra and Simulation by Jean Baudrillard. In fact, not only does Neo use it in the movie as a hiding place for his cache and computer files, but the directors of The Matrix, the Wachowskis, made this book required reading for their entire cast, something I've never heard of happening with a movie before. They obviously had a deep respect for this book, so what's going on inside its pages? Well, I dove into it, and I have to say it was a very tough read. Here's a random passage. The era of simulation is inaugurated by a liquidation of all referentials, and that it lends itself to all systems of equivalences, to all binary oppositions, to all combinatory algebra. What the f does that mean? Well, I've done my best to decipher and understand it all. This book, for only being 160 pages, talks about everything from ancient religion to modern American society. It even refers to storing humans in liquid and underground cities along the way, which the directors of The Matrix may have taken quite literally when they were writing their script. We'll even talk about how the author of the book ended up hating the movie. I'm ready to tackle it all, so sit back and enjoy as we delve into the dark and tangled piece of literature that inspired one of the greatest pieces of cinema ever made. Simulacra and Simulation begins with a quote from the Book of Ecclesiastes, said to be written by King Solomon in his old age. The simulacrum is never what hides the truth. It is truth that hides the fact that there is none. Again, what the heck does this mean? Well, simulacrum means an image or representation of someone or something, very close to the word simulation. He's saying the simulation is hiding the fact that there's nothing underneath. This quote, in a way, perfectly encapsulates everything the book is trying to say. There is no reality. There is no truth. What we as a society have decided to represent, the image we decide to portray, the masks we decide to wear, and the hamster wheels we decide to run on, that becomes the closest thing to reality, to the truth. Because what else is there? Microsoft and Apple are our gods, and who in America is truly living off the grid or outside the influence of the internet? But I'm getting ahead of myself. This book uses a lot of anecdotes, a lot of stories and metaphors, and the first one is the Borges fable. This is by Jorge Luis Borges. He's passed away now. He was a famous writer from Argentina. Borges wrote a thought experiment that challenges you to consider the power of simulation. He imagines a man who creates maps, a cartographer who has gone mad and become determined to create a map so precise it captures every inch of the landscape, every tree, every bush, every house. Obviously, this is impossible. You can try, and then as the trees fall, houses get turned into condos, there's fire and earthquakes, your map is going to be further and further from the truth. So okay, we decide to make a new map. But in the thought experiment, the second man that comes along and is making the second map only has the first one to use as his basis. So now it becomes even further from reality. And then a third man, and on, until the map no longer represents the territory in any way. The only function of the map becomes to convince people that this territory still exists. So why depict it at all? Not only that, how do we know what the first guy did to make his map? Did he actually walk every inch of land, verifying everything with his eyes? I doubt it. And how many versions of the map have we been through? This fable is a perfect metaphor for what this book discusses. How would we locate what's real, and why would we locate what's real when it's so much easier to just point to the map and accept it? Now that map, which is likely BS, becomes our reality, and the author is arguing that that's what's happened with society. The book goes on, to simulate is to feign, to fake, to have what one doesn't have. That implies a presence rather than an absence. To explain this, it uses a quote from famous French philosopher and Freemason Litre. Whoever fakes an illness can stay in bed and make everyone believe he is ill, and whoever simulates that illness produces in himself some of the symptoms. The book goes on. Therefore, pretending leaves the principle of reality intact. Is the simulator sick or not, given that he produces true symptoms? Objectively, one cannot treat him as being either ill or not ill. That's some heavy stuff. It reminds me of something I read in the book Becoming Supernatural, which might help explain it even further, that there was a study where a team of Harvard researchers took a group of volunteers who had never before played the piano and divided the group in half. One half practiced a simple 5-finger piano exercise for 2 hours a day for 5 days. The remaining half did the same thing, except only imagining they were sitting at the piano, without physically moving their fingers in any way. Now, the crazy part is, the before and after brain scans showed that both groups created a dramatic number of new neural circuits in the region of their brains that controls finger movements, even though only one group actually played the piano in real life. The folks who mentally rehearsed the actions had brains that looked like the experience had already happened, even though they never lifted a finger. Not only that, similar studies show the same kinds of results with muscle training. In a study at the Cleveland Clinic, 10 subjects between the ages of 20 and 35 imagined flexing one of their biceps as hard as they could 5 sessions a week for 12 weeks. By the end of the study, the subjects had increased their bicep strength by 13.5%, even though they hadn't actually been using their muscles at all, only their mind. They maintained this gain for 3 months after the training session stopped. So, even though this is a philosophy book, there are actual Harvard studies backing up some of the things it's trying to say. And a lot of this goes hand in hand with Neo's journey in the Matrix, where so much of his progress was based on believing he could jump across 2 buildings, believing he could do the kung fu. What does Morpheus say when Neo finally starts kicking Agent Smith's ass?
He's beginning to believe.
In the world of the Matrix, when Neo thinks something is true, it becomes so, for better or for worse, just like the map in the fable. The book then takes its first shot at deconstructing society using the story of the Tassidae tribe. This is a fascinating story I'd never heard about until I read the book. The Tassidae tribe is a group of indigenous people who lived in the southern Philippine island of Mindanao. They first gained international attention in 1971 when a group of 26 individuals were discovered living in complete isolation from the outside world. They were portrayed and referred to as a Stone Age tribe, living in caves and surviving by hunting and gathering. They were dressed in leaves, and it was even said they had no words for war or violence. Even in the 70s, this was huge news that we had discovered a people frozen in time like this. Many flew to the Philippines to study the ethnic group, and it was even carried as a cover story by the National Geographic. The magazine devoted 32 pages of coverage about the tribe. Best-selling books were written about them, and pretty soon, it seemed the Tassidae lost touch with their ancient ways as they began living in huts and generally taking on a more modern way of life. The book says, by discovering these people, we destroyed them and their culture. It makes the point that this is why we never analyze our own society, because all the holes we'd find in it would cause it to fall apart. The book notes, in order for ethnology, the study of people, to live, its object must die. By dying, the object takes its revenge for being discovered, and with its death defies the science that wants to grasp it. It is against this hell of the paradox that the ethnologists wish to protect themselves by cordoning off the Tassidae with virgin forest. No one can touch them anymore, and indeed, the government of the Philippines eventually decided to ban civilian and journalist contact with the Tassidae tribe, seemingly in order to preserve the tribe's purity. Here's where it gets crazy. The entire thing was a hoax. You see, the tribe was discovered by businessman Manuel Elizalde Jr., who was known for being a playboy and a drunk. He was in command after President of the Philippines at the time, Ferdinand Marcos, appointed him presidential assistant on national minorities. Isn't it a bit of a coincidence that this political figure was running around the jungle like Indiana Jones and happened to stumble upon this never-discovered tribe of people? Well, you'd be right to be skeptical. It was revealed that the Tassidae were not some previously undiscovered tribe, but rather a group of Manobo people who had been convinced into the Stone Age Act by the Marcos government. The Tassidae were used as a propaganda tool by the Marcos government to promote the idea of a peaceful and harmonious Philippines. The Tassidae told a 2020 film crew that Elizalde had paid them back in 1971 to take their clothes off and pretend to be a Stone Age tribe. Not only that, when Elizalde restricted public and journalist access to the tribe, he enacted a decree which he said was protecting their almost 50,000 acres of land. It has been claimed this was all a giant play to secure mining and timber rights for himself. When I asked Bing AI about it, it referred to the Tassidae story as one of the biggest government hoaxes ever discovered. So to me, this is complete poetry. Even the metaphor the book uses to show how fake and fragile society is turns out to not be real. The book then goes on to ask how the Tassidae tribe is different from our own modern society, and I think that's a great point. To bring it back to the Matrix, it reminds me of when Neo awakes to his reality. His office job has now lost all meaning. When he's trying to trek through the city with Morpheus, people are bumping into him. There's a very hostile energy. It almost reminds me of the dream scenes from Inception, where it's like these people know that you're onto them. You become dangerous when you become aware. And whether you're a journalist digging too deeply into the Tassidae tribe, or merely a person on the internet educating themselves about modern society, you become a threat. All that being said, there is something the book considers to be even more fake than the story of the Tassidae tribe, and it might surprise you. So, our author Jean Baudrillard did have an idea for the perfect example of a simulation, and he names it in the book Disneyland. He calls it a perfect model of all the entangled orders of simulacra. However, the author says that the true purpose of Disneyland is not to entertain people, but to make them think the rest of America is real and normal. He says that Disneyland is a social microcosm, which means a small version of society that reflects its values and beliefs. He says Disneyland shows people the religious, miniaturized pleasures of real America. Quote, Disneyland is presented as imaginary in order to make us believe that the rest is real, whereas all of Los Angeles and the America that surrounds it are no longer real, but belong to the hyperreal order and to the order of the simulation. This world wants to be childish in order to make us believe that the adults are elsewhere in the quote, real world, and to conceal the fact that true childishness is everywhere, that it is that of the adults themselves who come here to act the child in order to foster illusions as to their real childishness. I don't want the Disney adults to come for me. I'm just reading what he wrote, but I did find it to be pretty interesting stuff. Walt Disney's body has been cryogenically frozen since he died in the hopes that one day he can be revived. The author ends this whole passage by mentioning what he believes to be an ironic coincidence, which is that Disneyland is a frozen childlike world created by a man who is now frozen himself. The book then even takes aim at museums and discusses the mummy of ancient King Ramses II. The author says the West is obsessed with preserving a mummy like this because, quote, it guarantees that accumulation has meaning. Our entire culture collapses if we cannot stockpile the past in plain view. To this end, the pharaohs must be brought out of their tomb and the mummies out of their silence. They are prey to both science and the worms. Wow, funny enough, this passage makes me think of Disney. Just like we drag the mummy out of the tomb, we drag 40-year-old cartoon characters into remakes to run around an amusement park. And as their stock price plunges into nothingness, Disneyland is still alive and well for now because it's filled with what we call Disney adults who are reliving the nostalgia of their childhood. But those people won't be around forever. Kids these days do not care as much about Disney. I was reading a book called The Psychology of Money, and I learned the S&P 500, which is a stock market index that tracks the value of the 500 largest corporations on the planet, didn't even exist until 1957. It's barely been around 60 years, and yet we consider it a sure bet for investment. put your money in the S&P, work hard, one day you can buy a house. This is what we say, and yet, as surely as the mummy of Ramses II signifies the end of his rule, the S&P will also one day be something in a history book alongside Disney and the entire American empire. I feel the author is arguing that here in North America, we are running our own capitalist version of Disneyland. And whether you think that's a good or bad thing, at some point, the park does have to close. So, what does that decay look like, and how does it relate to the Matrix? So, the middle of the book kind of becomes a giant rant about society. The author praises JFK and talks about how Watergate was a, quote, simulation of a scandal, a situation where the system humiliates somebody to make itself look fair while everyone else in it is just as dirty. This passage actually made me think of cancel culture, where a lot of people are maybe getting what they deserve, but the system itself remains dirty and corrupt. We then get this cheerful little passage, quote, "People have the desire to take everything, to pillage everything, to swallow everything, to manipulate everything." He says that the corporate powers who run the world are frightened by the idea of that they're afraid of not being able to control the masses using culture. This is something that the author keeps touching on, how dark he thinks humanity really is underneath it all. It's just my opinion, but I feel like a lot of this book is talking about how everything we've built in society, from religion to Disneyland, is simply a mask to distract us from nothing having any meaning, and to keep us from killing and ripping each other's face off in the street. And it is one thing I did find to be a far cry from The Matrix, which replaces a lot of these dark themes with an inspiring hero's journey. And yet, how did Neo's journey begin? By realizing that the world he had been living in had no meaning. Perhaps both the author and the directors of The Matrix are implying that this realization is what sets you free on the journey itself. There is then a passage which mentions underground cities, which I think could have been the inspiration for Zion, the underground city that humans take shelter from the machines in The Matrix. The author talks about how every city must eventually fall, and that even an underground city would be no different because, quote, "the city no longer revives." And that does make me think of Zion. It's not the most hopeful place, it's just somewhere that people are trying to stay alive and hide. He talks about how even the greatest cities have to eventually become, quote, sites of implosion, basically an area that's eating itself. He says as this process of the city rotting develops along, society becomes more and more brutal, but he adds that he doesn't consider this a bad thing because it's necessary for evolution. He goes as far as to say, quote, "We were a culture of liberating violence, and that now violence has become too rooted in power and production." From there, the book even takes a shot at religion, basically saying that God as we know him is no longer real because the scriptures are interpreted and reinterpreted and translated and retranslated again and again, kind of like the map from the Borges fable. He includes this quote, "I forbade that there be any simulacra in the temples because the divinity that animates nature can never be represented." He then talks about repression and says that surveillance cameras themselves are, quote, "part of the decor of simulacra. A perfect surveillance would not be profitable. It, the camera, is thus an illusion to repression. This sign can thus coexist with all the others. For example, those huge billboards inviting you to relax and to choose complete serenity. These billboards, in fact, observe and surveil you as well, or as badly as the policing television. The latter looks at you, you look at yourself in it, a game of splitting in two and doubling that closes this world in on itself." Jeez. In the movie The Matrix, I feel that the police perfectly represented this repression, and they were great in the movie as kind of the lower guardians of the system below Agent Smith. The author says, "We live in a world with more and more information and less meaning." Then there is another passage that I think inspired something in The Matrix. "Everything is sepulchral, white, black, salmon marble, a bunker case in deep, snobbish, dull black mineral underground space, total absence of fluids. There is no longer even a liquid gadget like the veil of water." You mean like the veil of water that Neo put aside when he woke up? To me, this passage exactly describes the place that human bodies are being stored for energy in the movie. It seems the directors decided to interpret a lot of this book literally. Zooming out from the underground, the author then talks about how the supermarket, quote, cannot be separated from the highways that surround and feed it, from the parking lots blanketed in automobiles, from the computer terminal, from the whole town, as a total functional screen of activities. He calls all of this a giant montage factory. I imagine this guy criticizing screens in the 80s would not be too thrilled with the iPhones of today. But now that we brought that up, there is a lot of writing about technology in this book, especially considering it's over 40 years old, and I think you'll be interested in some of what it has to say about the tech of the future. And oh boy, people will have a lot to say about this part, I think. Basically, Baudrillard starts to talk about cloning. I don't know if this was a hot term at the time, but it seems like he's mostly referring to the process of creating artificial life. He says, when the artificial person materializes, it signifies imminent death for humanity. What, if not a death drive, would push sexed being to regress to a form of reproduction prior to sexuation? This is where the gender debate is perhaps leading towards. Again, crazy that a book as old as this is saying these things. This part for me has aged badly. I think everyone has a right to their identity and to live with that identity in peace. And I'm sure if Baudrillard was here today, he would agree. I mean, both of the people who directed The Matrix are transgender, and I wonder what they might make of this passage. That being said, I think this next part's gonna get everybody. The father and the mother have disappeared, not in the service of the subject, but in the service of a matrix called code. No more father, no more mother, a matrix. And it is the matrix, that of the genetic code, that now infinitely gives birth based on a functional mode purged of all sexuality. I mean, wow, you can obviously see the inspiration for the movie coming through there, down to maybe even the title. I noticed something else from the movie as I kept reading. The author is talking about how we may one day have the ability to make humans out of only 1 or 2 cells of our body, and he says, quote, each segment of the worm is directly reproduced as a whole worm, just as each fragment of a hologram can again become the matrix of the complete hologram. This is exactly how Agent Smith reproduces in the movie, simply by sticking a piece of his hand to somebody or from just goo on the ground. And again, the author reiterates how he thinks this will doom humanity, or at least will be a huge turning point for humanity. Quote, cloning is the last stage of the history and modeling of the body. The book goes on, quote, it is not when one has everything taken away that nothing is left. Rather, nothing is left when things are unceasingly shifted, and addition itself no longer has any meaning. Maybe there's nothing to believe in anymore. Is that the case? Well, this is where the book shifts into perhaps what is its most important chapter on that very thing, nihilism. Alright, so nihilism, if you don't know, is the belief in nothing, and it's usually about as bleak as it sounds. Even the Oxford Dictionary defines it as the rejection of all religious and moral principles in the belief that life is meaningless. The author makes his feelings here very clear, starting the chapter off with, quote, I am a nihilist, but not in the way you might think. Now, this is the most important chapter because I noticed when I was researching that when Neo picks the book up in the movie, it's on the chapter called On Nihilism. Not only that, but he appears to be holding the middle of the book, while On Nihilism is actually the book's final chapter. So the directors went far out of their way to showcase this specific part. The author begins by remarking, quote, the apocalypse is finished. Today it is the procession of the neutral and of indifference. To him, humanity ends not with a bang, but an artificial whimper. Perhaps not even a whimper, more of a meh, which is arguably even worse. The author argues that there is no longer any room for romance or love in this new era. Instead, people are fascinated by the, quote, desert-like and indifferent forms that exist in this new world. This is actually the one quote the movie plucks directly from the book when Morpheus first wakes Neo up and says,
welcome to the desert of the real.
That's exactly how the author describes the world we now live in. He goes on to say that all that remains is the very operation of the system that annihilates us, that we're obsessed with creating our own destruction. He goes as far as to say that we are, quote, all fascinated by the idea of disappearing, and it's at the same time a melancholy and fascinating situation we find ourselves in. Now, this book and The Matrix are both ahead of their time in a lot of ways, but I think this is something that is actually still ahead of its time today, because as AI and technology improves, and there's less and less reason to leave the house, less and less reason to try new things, to create new things as a human, not to mention that sex might become more and more taboo, the less interaction we have between each other. At that point, humanity's future is obviously up in the air. Maybe this is the message that the directors wanted to send in this shot, that our reliance on machines is going to destroy us. But it's more than that. The author takes the philosopher Nietzsche's famous "God is dead" quote and says, "God is not dead, he has become hyper-real, an excuse for tax cuts and for the simulation to roll on, a map that's been made and remade a million times until it's a shadow of its former self." He says, meanwhile, the masses themselves are, quote, "caught up in a giant process of inertia through acceleration." He says if it is nihilistic to point out this obsession with destroying ourselves, then again, quote, "I am a nihilist." If it is nihilistic to be obsessed by the mode of disappearance and no longer by the mode of production, then I am a nihilist. The system is too strong. Anything we do, quote, "does not resolve the imperious necessity of checking the system in broad daylight. This only terrorism can do." Jeez. He does make it clear he's not talking about literal terrorism, and this is pre-9/11, but I still found what's coming pretty shocking. Then when I thought about it, of course if Neo was around today, he would be considered a terrorist and a radical. This guy's running around shooting up downtown. Heck, the movie might not even be allowed to come out today. Perhaps the level of violence in the movie was also inspired by this passage, because just as Baudrillard is about to make it clear that his terrorism is metaphorical, technically Neo's is too, since it's taking place in a simulation where nothing's real. Baudrillard continues, and to me this is the climax of the book. If being a nihilist is carrying this radical trait of derision and of violence, this challenge that the system is summoned to answer through its own death, then I am a terrorist and nihilist in theory as the others are with their weapons. Theoretical violence, not truth, is the only resource left us. But such a sentiment is utopian, because it would be beautiful to be a nihilist if there were still radicality, as it would be nice to be a terrorist if death, including that of the terrorist, still had any meaning. Wow. He finishes, "Death no longer has a stage on which to represent itself, to play itself out. There is no longer a stage. All of that comes to be annihilated on the television screen. We are in the era of events without consequences. There is no more hope for meaning. And without a doubt, this is a good thing. Meaning is mortal. This is where seduction begins." Assumedly by the machines. And that's the last line of the book. This is where seduction begins. I personally found this a chilling ending for a very dark and heavy book. So, is there hope? A lot of this has obviously been very dark. For the record, the author Baudrillard hated The Matrix. He died 8 years after the movie came out in 2007. He said, "The Matrix is surely the kind of film about the Matrix that the Matrix would have been able to produce." When I first read that, I said, God, that's such a pretentious philosopher thing to say. What does that even mean? But in this interview, he does break it down, and some of it makes sense. His best point is that the movie is obsessed with the digital universe and computer-generated images. And looking back on it, it is pretty ironic that a movie about how dangerous machines are is using all this groundbreaking technology, from the special effects designers who worked on it to the plot itself, where Neo uses human tech to learn kung fu and fight the bad guys. Baudrillard also felt that the directors got confused between his version of simulation and Plato's. Plato was an ancient Greek philosopher who had an allegory about a cave. It was his idea of what simulation looks like. In Plato's idea, a bunch of people are sitting in a dark cave, and all they know are the shadows on the wall. They accept it as reality because it's all they've ever seen. They watch the shadows flicker day in, day out. And yet Plato said it's possible to exit the cave and free yourself from the darkness. Once the person escapes the cave, Plato said they are initially angry and upset because their eyes burn in the overwhelming sunlight. It's like Morpheus said, people don't want to be unplugged. They want to keep watching the shadows on the wall and stay in the system. Except in Baudrillard, our author's world, there is no leaving the cave because it's all we have left. And yeah, he has a point, because unlike his book, The Matrix gives us the idea that it's possible to break free. This is simply a more complex version of what I noticed before, that The Matrix seems to hold hope, and ironically the book that it's inspired by is the complete opposite. Was this a choice by the directors, or would Hollywood simply not have allowed a movie this bleak to come out? It almost comes down to a choice, and maybe that's what I want to leave you with today. Are you going to try to exit the cave today? To me, every time I meditate or make it into the gym or put myself in a social situation that intimidates me, I've left the cave. Then I come home, look at my hamster on his wheel night after night, and wonder if I'm caught in the same meaningless pattern as him. In the end, perhaps Baudrillard and The Matrix are two sides of the same coin, and the only difference is the attitude you approach it all with. Speaking of the gym, I was there in between writing this video, and I was listening to a podcast with billionaire Mark Cuban. He says he's going to train AI to replicate him as a person, and he's gonna be immortal.
Take all those emails and ingest it and train a model so that long after I'm gone, I'll be immortal.
No, he is not going to be immortal. He is going to be gone. And one day, it might even become a crime to say that and discriminate against the AI version of him, so I apologize in advance. That being said, when I heard him talk about this, I wondered, is it possible to hear something more relevant to the video I'm writing right now? Because if we accept the AI version of him as reality, in a way it does become a fact that he's still here. Yet again, we are remaking the map and accepting the newest version. I'll take it a step further. You can even take me making this video right now. I'm no longer the real me with all my flaws and anxieties. I'm merely a projection of how you perceive me when you watch this. Because this video will always be around, and I may not be. The way I talk and move in this video now becomes me, like a simulated prison in Black Mirror. How is this different from the map, from Disneyland, from the social media feed that we accept as reality? In conclusion, it's not that we live in a simulation. A simulation implies this is fake. Meanwhile, the question this book asks is, if the simulation has completely taken over our lives and there's nothing underneath it, how is the simulation not our new reality, or what's even left? Thanks for your time, and whether you try and leave the cave or stay in it, because, to quote The Matrix's villain,
ignorance is bliss.
Either way, I wish us all luck.